Hi. So I'm going to talk about persecution, and it might be a little basic for some people in the room, but I hope to give a few examples that are from outside the US and to kind of offer a little bit of a comparative approach. Although a lot of what I'm talking about applies in the EU, where I do most of my work, as well as in the United States. I'll start with an introduction to some of the basic legal instruments, which we're probably all familiar with, but just to go through and particularly look at persecution and how it's defined. Then I'll talk about kind of generally what persecution means in different countries. Again, I'll probably be using the UK and the US as my guideposts. And then I'll talk about persecution in the context of LGBTI claims and go through a couple of the issues that actually Neil mentioned in his talk, and maybe build on and talk about what usually qualifies as persecution and what doesn't usually qualify as persecution in those areas of abuse. Then I'll talk about persecution in context, kind of looking at one particular trend that's been talked about both here and specifically in the UK in the last year, after a big judgment in the UK came down, eliminating the discretion test for LGB applicants. It didn't really mention trans or intersex people, but it can be extrapolated to gender variant claimants. I'll talk about the pushback from I guess, immigration policy officials after that judgment. So the judgment was seen as a big victory, but there are a lot of other problems that the judgment has created for claimants. And then I'll show a few resources at the very end, which are just websites that I tend to turn to for a lot of my research on the issue. So I'm sure we're all familiar with the Geneva Convention, but for those of you who might not be, the 1951 Geneva Convention on the status of refugees and the 1967 Protocol, which opened up the idea of the refugee to anyone fitting a certain description, not just people who were fitting that description and claimed persecution from events that happened during the Second World War. Though that document has basically become the document that national governments and regional bodies look to for guidance. I mean, countries sign on to the Geneva Convention, but also have to interpret its rules and interpret what it means by persecution. Persecution isn't really defined in the Geneva Convention at all, so it's really up to countries to create some sort of international consensus, some best practice, and even that, obviously, because there is no such thing as a real consensus on these issues. It varies from country to country what persecution actually means. So the convention is kind of the guidepost. The 2008 UNHCR guidance note on refugee claims relating to sexual orientation and gender identity has been really instructive for countries, particularly in the EU, to harmonize their ideas of what persecution means, what it means to qualify as a refugee under certain circumstances that were very variant in the EU. Just for example, just because I know that the debates in the EU best. There was a lot of discussion before the guidance note came out on whether or not a state actor had to be the actor primarily responsible for the persecution. Obviously now we know that there's lots of jurisprudence of non-state actors causing persecution, but there was a lot of variance as to how much the state had to tolerate a non-state actor persecuting an individual before allowing the non-state actor to be the reason for persecution and allowing the refugee claim on that basis. So France was a country that was particularly vehement about preferencing claims coming from state actor rather than a non-state actor. And after the guidance note came out, there was a great deal of harmonization on that issue so that non-state actors were also given kind of, full weight was given to claims made on the basis of persecution by a non-state actor. So gangs, family members, paramilitaries, that sort of stuff. So it was a very important guidance note. Also for persecution as a concept, it kind of got countries talking and got them on the same page about it in Europe at least. And then you have national implementation. So for example, our basic immigration laws, the Immigration Nationality Act, the Refugee Act, in the UK, the National Immigration and Asylum Act, are all responsible for bringing the Geneva Convention basically into national legislation, implementing the treaty. At the bottom, I put humanitarian protection because outside of the scope of actually applying for refugee protection, there are other ways of getting leave to remain in certain countries that you're applying for asylum in. And leave to remain doesn't mean you have refugee status, and it doesn't necessarily mean you are claiming persecution based on a Geneva Convention reason, which I'll get to the next slide. But it means that you can't be sent back to your country of origin because you'll be tortured or treated with severe severe violation of human rights. So on the international level, we have the Convention Against Torture, which the United States is obviously a party to, and which is responsible for lots of people being able to stay in the U.S. regardless of whether or not they, or in spite of them being rejected as an applicant for asylum. So quickly, we've gone through this earlier, but the Geneva Convention defines a refugee as someone owing to the well-founded fear of being persecuted by reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, which is the category that most concerns LGBTI applicants, or political opinion. Political opinion has also been used in some claims, though many times not successfully, based on the fact that LGBT people, if they identify themselves as activists or are somehow recognizably affiliated with a certain political leaning on the basis of being an LGBT person, can use that as part of their claim for asylum. Having to go through that process of completing that extra step and saying, oh, it's because of political opinion, can sometimes be more difficult than just the PSG idea. But it's another type of claim that LGBTI people have been able to use to get asylum. And then the rest we've done. I won't spend time going through just that definition.